Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about the Marvels movie once again. And I'm doing this because there seems to be a great disconnect within nerd culture, sci-fi, and fantasy sphere, where you have people who really love the movie and people who really don't like the movie. But the thing is that when watching a lot of those movie reviews from people who don't like the movie, I think almost every one of them I've seen are proceeding upon a false assumption. And this false premise that these negative reviewers actually proceed upon is either in the forefront or the back of their mind, and they think this movie is obviously not ready for release. And they give various different reasons for this, but the assumption is, why would Marvel Disney release what is obviously a movie that is going to bomb? Why would they do that to themselves? And I think, again, that's either at the forefront or in the back of the mind of many of these reviews, all that I've seen, when really the question needs to be asked in the opposite way. The assumption should be that Marvel Disney actually thinks this is a good movie and it is ready for release. So the question becomes, why in the world does Marvel Disney think that this is a good movie ready for release? And just quickly, I want to say, some of my regular viewers might be asking, why am I covering this so much? Quite honestly, it's because an older subscriber to my channel made a very astute observation a couple of weeks ago, saying that they hadn't been to my channel for a while, but my channel has really taken a hit over the last little while. And that's true. I used to get about 6,000 to 8,000 views per video. Now it's down to about 2,000. But I'm not going to blame YouTube for that, nor am I going to chase the algorithm. What I'm going to do is just put some more effort into my channel, as in more engagement through community posts and also paying more attention to the timing of when and how I produce a video, because I would probably be covering this anyways, just usually about 3 or 4 weeks later when no one really cares about the Marvels anymore. And I do want to get back to that level of where I was before with viewership, because part of the reason for this channel is to help sell my graphic novels, and links are in the description for my 3 graphic novels. 2 superhero graphic novels, Thomas Valiant and the Valiant Heroes, both available at the Valiant Hero Indiegogo site. They are stories about people who want to be traditional, virtuous heroes in a world that's anything but. And the other link is for my upcoming low fantasy book, Crom the Destroyer, which is about an aging king who wants nothing more than to die honorably on the battlefield, but in pursuing that, he actually runs across something where he has to start fighting even harder to stay alive in order to maintain his honor. And you're looking at some of the beautiful art from those graphic novels in the background, so if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and the pinned comment and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. But back to my topic. And really, I want to answer that question right off the bat. I won't leave you hanging. Why in the world would Marvel Disney have the mindset that this movie, The Marvels, is actually ready to be released and is going to do well? Because again, a lot of people are pointing out problems with consistency within the movie or within other MCU productions. With this one, there's no continuity sometimes in the movie itself. There's no continuity with other parts of the MCU. There's that. Many other people have noted how it has a sort of sitcom Disney feel to it, as if it was more a television show that's just been extended for 1 hour and 45 minutes. It's not actually movie quality. Others have talked about the bad CGI and how it is not something worthy of a major movie. Worthy of a television show, maybe, but not a major movie. Things like this. I'm sure there are many more, wherein the critics will say, this shows that this movie is just not ready to be released. Certainly not in the form that it is. Therefore, why in the world would they release it knowing that it's going to bomb? But I think the more rational way to look at it is to ask the question, why in the world did they think it would do well? Because I would assume that they put it out there thinking it was ready to be released and was going to do well. And the question all is answered by the fact that the concentration for this movie and how it is put together, and even how Marvel movies and television shows, really everything within the MCU, are put together right now, are based entirely around a center of the emotional. So things like continuity issues don't matter. Things like really good CGI don't matter. Things like a sitcom feel to it or a campy feel to it don't matter. Why? Because you're simply on an emotional roller coaster, and if you accept that, you will enjoy the ride. And I'm going to show that this is most probably the case through the words of the person who has, I would say, the most direct control over the production of this movie, which would be the director. I'm going to use quotes from her as much as possible from 3 different articles that I found. One was Variety, one was, I think, Entertainment Weekly, and the other one was the Toronto Sun. I'll put links for all of those in the description, although I'm using mostly the Variety article. But before we get to that article, let me lay some groundwork as to how this kind of thinking pervades not just this movie, but also the MCU in general, and Marvel, Disney in general, and really the whole science fiction fantasy genre in general right now. Well, in the mainstream anyways. So I did a video probably about 6 months ago now about a Zoom call that was posted online to YouTube by the Writers Guild Association of America. It's probably still up on their YouTube channel. And the title of the Zoom call was Queering Legacy Characters. And what they were talking about was superhero characters. And they had a number of different people on this panel. They had a number of different comic book writers. They had some comic book writers who had written comics and had worked in television. You had some people which exclusively worked on television shows about superheroes. You had showrunners for these kinds of shows. And you had producers there as well. So you had a very big cross-section of these people. And they're all talking about queering legacy characters within the comics and then bringing that into the shows at the very least. And there's also a little bit of discussion about bringing it into the movies. Because, well, they're talking about Marvel and DC here almost exclusively. And the question arose and was really answered, I think, in a very definitive way when they asked the question, how do you take a character that has 50, 60, 70, 80 years of continuity where they weren't queer characters, where they weren't part of this alphabet community, and then suddenly change them into that? Doesn't that break the continuity of the character? And they answered the question as follows, as I covered in that video. They believe that that is actually the real continuity for those characters because they define continuity in a way that's completely different than the normal definition of continuity. For most fans of science fiction and fantasy, where continuity is something that is highly prized and sought after within your product, normally people would think of continuity as being some objective things that happen to this character or place or world in the past that have to be acknowledged because they're part of the history of, well, we're talking about characters exclusively here, so part of the history of that character and therefore must inform how the character operates in any present story. But the people on this panel, again, a great cross-section of people talking about superhero comics, television, and movies, said, no, that's not what continuity actually is. What continuity is, it's more like a river of subjective emotion. And they gave this basic example. You have Tim Drake, Robin, in the comic books. And recently, I think over the last year, they've taken Robin in the Batman comic books and in his own books and turned him into a queer character. He's one of the alphabet people now. And people always ask me, why do I say alphabet people? Well, first of all, it's really a tongue twister to go through the entire list of letters from the alphabet every time I want to say that. And secondly, I'm trying to use a neutral term because I want to be rational about this discussion, and we'll talk about it in a neutral way. So it's not affirming or denying anything about anything in itself, so we can concentrate on the premises that I'm trying to prove. Anyways, they talked about making Robin one of these alphabet people and how it was a natural progression for the character and a natural progression for his continuity. Why? Because since at least the 60s, there's been this question out there of whether various Robins were of the alphabet people persuasion, and so people started to run with this topic, and then over the last 20, 30, 40 years, they've written fan fiction about it, and people have their own headcanon about it, and that headcanon has expanded to a point within the natural progression of comics and comic readers that it's not an absurd idea. And then we have the last couple of years where it's a promoted idea, and therefore they're just going to make it this way within the comics now because that's the emotional continuity of the people who read the comics, which is the important part. And that trumps the actual continuity, which is, the objective continuity within the comics and the actions. And that's how you can queer a legacy character while, as they would assume, keeping the continuity of the character because it's all about the emotional core of that character, and the emotional core of that character is contained within the reader's minds, or who they assume to be the reader's minds, not within the stuff that's down there on the page. Now, very briefly, and I'm going to touch on this again in this video, you'll see this kind of mindset is a production of an ideology which assumes there is no such thing as capital T truth. And I call it ideology because the idea that there is no truth must be stated as if it were true if you're stating it, and therefore it's a self-defeating proposition in itself. So this is an ideological, not a rational or logical statement that there is no truth. And again, that can be seen by the fact that if there is no truth, then you can't be rational and logical to begin with because they're based on logic and reason. Anyway, it's an ideological assumption that there is no such thing as truth, which trickles down to the idea that there is no such thing as objectivity. And so there's only subjectivity. And where does that subjectivity come from? It comes from emotion. So it's a product of rampant relativism. Everything is relative to my emotional state, whoever my is in that statement, whatever individual they may be. And again, it has to be emotion, not thought, because thought is ordered through reason, and reason is based upon objectivity, which assumes that there is a truth that can actually tell you what is objective. So again, it has to be based upon emotion. And that's exactly what they're talking about within the so-called continuity of queering a legacy character. That's the continuity, the emotional continuity of the reader, and therefore then the character, and then therefore they can do this to the character and in their minds keep that continuity. Now, let's move on to another example. The other example is from the MCU television shows. I went over, probably again about 8 months ago, maybe more, an interview with the director of the She-Hulk series. Now, this director is talking about, by herself and with others in various interviews, about the feminist empowerment that comes with this She-Hulk television show. But here's the thing. Most of us that have lived for 20, 30, maybe 40 years or more, look back at feminism and looking at or having experienced that history would say that part of that history was to extract women from the idea that they were simply complete emotional beings, especially complete emotional beings that were prone to outbursts of emotion, especially negative emotion. But when you hear the director of She-Hulk talk about the feminist empowerment idea behind She-Hulk, what does she say it's about? She says it's actually about the fact that She-Hulk can be a completely emotional being as a woman, and even to the point of being an expression of that feminist rage, which is nothing but emotion, and that's female empowerment. To her, that was the core of the character and the core of the story. And the entire thing, you can see, is based upon emotion. Now, I have a third example, but let's get into some of this article first so that it makes a little bit more sense. So the title of the Variety article is How the Marvels Got Its Blurred Girl Energy, and the subtitle is Nina DaCosta Ignored the Haters and Made the Movie Her Teenage Self Would Want to See. Now, first off, let's discuss the elephant in the room right off the bat. What is blurred energy? Well, blurred is short for black nerd because you can't even be a nerd anymore without entering intersectionality into it. You have to be a black nerd. You have to take your skin color and then intersect it with your nerddom. Secondly, there is a statement within each of these articles and more that I've come across, which seems to be a blanket statement, I would say, since every one of them have the same statement and it's almost exactly the same in every one. It's a blanket statement, most probably from Marvel Disney. And that statement is, at 31, DaCosta became the youngest person and the first black woman to helm a Marvel Studios picture. So right off the bat, we see that there is this statement, as I would say, most probably from Marvel Disney, about the intersectionality of this person who is directing the film. Otherwise, why in the world do you need to state all of these identity markers about her? Which again, would point back to the very intersectional feminist idea that was encouraged within that She-Hulk television show, which I just talked about. Secondly, let's look at the subtitle for this article. It is Nina DaCosta Ignored the Haters and Made the Movie Her Teenage Self Would Want to See. Now, they get into that point almost at the very end of the article, so I'm going to skip to that just for a second here because it's very important. There's a quote from DaCosta, and she says, when talking about fandom, I quote, There are pockets where you go because you're like, I'm a super fan. I want to exist in the space of just adoration, which includes civilized critique, she explains. And she goes on and says, then there are pockets that are really virulent and violent, and for the sake of this platform, I'm just going to have to say ists and phobes of various kinds. This list includes the color of your skin, whether or not you're male or female, and who it is you want to sleep with. But she goes on and says ists and phobes and all those awful things, and I choose the side of the light. That's the part of fandom I'm most attracted to. Now, here's where I get into my third example. I covered a panel at, I think it was the New York City or San Francisco Comic-Con about 3 or 4 years ago. It was a Marvel panel, and it was headed up by the co-creator of Miss Marvel, who is one of the main characters within the Marvels, and they talked about how to shut out all negativity when you work on comic books. So it's specifically about comic book makers, most notably about Marvel comic books. And they were saying basically what Nina DaCosta is summing up here. You need to just take all of the good things and ignore all of the haters. Make sure that you shut them out every way that you possibly can, so you don't actually have to even listen to what they have to say. But here's the key. What Nina DaCosta says here, and what they discussed within that panel, is how do you distinguish between the two? Because Nina DaCosta is saying here, you need to accept those people who are there to just adore what you're doing, but also you can include who you listen to as civilized critique. So if your critique is not civilized, then you're one of these ists or phobes, you're one of these haters, and therefore everything that you have to say must be blocked out, which again is part of the gist of what Nina DaCosta is saying here as well. So how do you qualify what is a civilized critique? Well, if we go into the rest of this article, which I will in a minute, or even back to that panel from Marvel, which again is part of this entire corporation of Marvel, Disney, and the progenitor of the MCU and everything else, how you distinguish between them is basically whether or not those people are quote-unquote progressive. Now, how and why do I make that statement? Well, because this is the basic way that Marvel for comics right now actually operate. I've listened to so many Marvel podcasts from Marvel.com, and many of them are from people who are editors of Marvel comic books right now. And they talk about how they work. Over and over and over again, they have stated how a Marvel editor works right now is that you can never say no. You can never be negative. You can never tell these creative people, don't do it that way. That's wrong. You have to do it differently. You can never say that. That's not part of their job, they see as an editor. All they're there to do as an editor is to read the material that is presented to them and then offer suggestions to the artist who can then take or leave your suggestions being, I suggest that we can do this better in a way that's X, Y, and Z. But you can never, again, according to these people who are the actual editors for Marvel Comics, you can never say no. You can never say you can't do it this way. You can never say redo this because it's their voice. It's their story. You can just help them make it better in ways that you might see things that they don't see within the presentation of this. And it all comes back to this relativistic idea that it's your story, and your story is as true as anybody else's story. And since you're the one writing this or doing the art for this, then it's your truth. And the expansion of that relativism means that I can't come in and tell you this is wrong in any way, shape, or form. That would be negative. That would be uncivilized critique. And of course, if everything is just based upon the subjective my truth, everything goes back to emotion. So in the light of how Marvel operates in different spheres, I would say that Nina DaCosta is qualifying civilized critique here as being a critique that again is based upon this quote-unquote progressive ideological bent where everything is based upon complete relativism, which of course, again, is generated through emotion. Now, how can I say that she's just following along in the Marvel footsteps? Well, that's the next part of the interview. First off, we have to acknowledge that Nina DaCosta is coming from a place that is not 2023, where we are right now, and this movie is coming out. No, she is coming from the mindset of 2020-2021, and that is also the mindset of the studio at that time. So people are looking at things that are in the culture right now and seeing pushback against some of these ideas and are thinking, once again, why would they put this out right now? It's obviously not going to do well. Whereas they're looking at it from a 2020-2021 perspective saying, yeah, it's going to do great because of this, that, and the other thing, which are ideas that were prevalent much more towards the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. And we know this because Nina DaCosta talks about in this interview how she pitched this story, which is now the movie, to Kevin Feige in, it was late 2020 or early 2021. And he accepted that pitch, and that's how she became the director. But the important thing also to note here is the fact that she also talks about having access to Kevin Feige, who is the person who runs Marvel Disney, for the entire time that she was working on this film. She talks about having dinner with him over and over again and bouncing ideas off of him and him doing the same with her. So we know that she is very closely associated with and basing her ideas upon the person in control of Marvel Disney. So she's working very much within that Marvel Disney framework. Also important to note that when she got the job as director, Victoria Alonso was also partly in control of Marvel Disney. She has since, as they say here, exited the company, but Nina DaCosta is quoted here as saying that Victoria Alonso said to her at that time, and I quote, she was like, "This is going to be like the hardest thing you've ever done. It's also going to be the most fulfilling. We've got your back." So once again, you'll see that she's very much ensconced in the higher ups at Marvel, talking to her and giving her advice about how to make this movie, but also the fact that she has pitched a movie which they themselves agree with, and so they're both pulling in the same direction. A lot of people are saying this is just a movie that has been constructed by the Marvel Committee method, or the Disney Committee method. It was put together by committee. I would say, sure, it does look like that, but that doesn't exclude the fact that the director is also expressing a very specific story that is part of her unique voice, as they would say it within these circles. The both of those things can be true at the same time. And I should also point out that Nina DaCosta says both within the Variety article and the Entertainment Weekly article that she contacted as many directors from previous Marvel MCU movies as she could and talked to them about how to make the movie. So again, she's very much ensconced in this is the Marvel method of making an MCU movie right now, which I'll get into the process of that slightly in a minute. But I also right now wanted to touch on something else which Nina DaCosta says in the Variety article. In the article, she says, when she received the job to actually become the director of this movie, she says, and I quote, "Kamala Harris tweeted about it before it was officially announced, and I couldn't respond," DaCosta recalls, laughing. Then she says, "I feel like it really ruined my moment to connect with her." So let me just point something out and ask a question here. Number one, you can see that at the very least, Nina DaCosta is very much on the Democratic side of the aisle, if not the quote-unquote progressive side of the aisle. I would qualify Kamala Harris as one of these quote-unquote progressive people. And I don't think anyone on the conservative side of the spectrum would lament the fact that they didn't get to connect with Kamala Harris. That's why I would say she's probably someone who is a fangirl of Kamala Harris in some way. But secondly, my question is this. Again, in her mind, this occurred somewhere late 2020, 2021. So Kamala Harris was either the vice president at the time or the vice president in waiting. And I have to ask, how does this person, who is the vice president, have access to information that is not publicly available about who is going to be the director of a certain Hollywood film, especially if she has no personal connection to this person? Which she doesn't, because Nina DaCosta just said that she missed her chance to connect with Kamala Harris here. Where does that come up? How does this person who works for the government have access to this information? Again, she's stating here, it's not public information at that time. Just an interesting question that I thought I would ask, because it could be that the direction of this movie might not just be, and again, this is just me spouting off right here, if you want to call it that, it might not only be the direction that Marvel wants it to go, Marvel Disney wants it to go in, but there could be some government connection there as well, directing it in a certain way to say, we also want it to go over this way. And again, not so crazy when you actually ask that question and again realize what I've been talking about for, 6 years on my channel about how the second in command at Marvel Comics had access to Barack Obama, who is the then sitting president of the United States, so she could meet with him several times, besides her other connections to Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, the main meat of this article is in a quote which I'm going to give you now. Variety says, while DaCosta found the Marvel team to be incredibly supportive, working within their machine was an exercise in learning to, quote, trust the process. Early in the production, Larson, who would be Brie Larson, who's appearing in her 5th Marvel title, encouraged the filmmaker to brace for change, advising her not to hold on too tightly to anything. And then they have Nina DaCosta's statement about this. She says, I was like, cool, but here's what I can tell you. Yes, set pieces will change and script pages will change, but the reason why they wanted to make this movie in the first place and why I'm invested in this emotionally are these things. And then she stops and she corrects herself and starts again and says, as the script changed and evolved, the specifics of that emotionality was always the same. Now, before I break down that statement, let's look at what this emotionality actually looks like. Because within this Variety article, the Variety writer makes a statement which seems to hit the nail on the head about what it's about. And then later on, while I was watching some of the clips from Entertainment Weekly, I found out that this is actually a quote from Nina DaCosta herself. Variety says, the all-female team-up movie makes good on the promise of Avengers Endgame and its 6-second sequence in the fight against Thanos, where all the MCU's super women rally behind Captain Marvel. With the Marvels, DaCosta gives fan an hour and 45 minutes of that same energy as the trio join forces to face a new villain, also a woman. And again, this is a mimicking of what Nina DaCosta herself said within other interviews. She is quoted as saying things like, she went to go see Avengers Endgame and she hit that scene and then said to herself, yes, 2 more hours of this, please. So that's on her end of the spectrum within making the movie, but also she talks about the other end of the spectrum wherein the audience is supposed to interact with this piece of entertainment. And she says it in a way when she's talking about the first trailer, because she gave this interview between when the first trailer came out and the later trailers came out. And so there was a picture of the Bifrost, which is the Rainbow Bridge, in the first trailer, but no one knew who was going to be using that within the movie. And she said she wasn't going to touch that question because I won't squash any dreams, she said. The dreams can be squashed or fulfilled when they go see the movie. And to me, that doesn't really seem like a throwaway statement. That seems to be like a statement of what she hopes the people who go see this movie are going to have as a mindset coming into it, which is a fulfillment of those dreams that they themselves have had about these characters. Again, going back to that idea within the Writers Guild of America, where you have these people with headcanon, these people who write fan fiction, and that's the real continuity of the characters. Because personally, to me, I would say the best kind of movie would be one that goes in directions that I have never thought about, therefore is not really a fulfillment of my dreams of what is going to happen. And quite honestly, this goes back thousands of years in Western civilization about how to tell a story. I can go back to Aristotle's Poetics and how he talks about that unknown quality within a story needs to be there if you're going to actually have a good story. To me, that would be something quite at odds with the fact that this movie is just simply a wish fulfillment mechanism for what the people themselves actually believe to begin with. But if I follow Nina DaCosta's statements correctly, that's what she wants. She wants this to be a 2-hour fulfillment of I want more of that scene, a wish fulfillment of extending that scene to, well, they've cut it down now to 1 hour and 45 minutes, but at least 2 hours in her mind of that extended scene And it's what she wanted to do to begin with. It's what she pitched to Kevin Feige in order to get the job to make this movie. And it's also what Marvel themselves want, because she's had this intimate connection over and over again with the higher-ups at Disney, Marvel, and other people who have directed MCU movies. So she's going in the direction that Marvel Disney actually wanted to go in. But more importantly, she says that Brie Larson came to her, and they qualify that by saying, who's appearing in her 5th Marvel movie, which is, again, a way of saying she knows what's going on with these Marvel movies, and she's telling her, don't hold on to anything too tightly because things are going to change. And so Nina DaCosta qualifies that statement by saying that the reason why they wanted her to make the movie in the first place, and the reason why she wanted to make the movie herself and was emotionally invested in the movie, was because both her and the studio ensured that emotionality was at the core of this movie. As she says, the script changed and evolved, but the specific emotionality was always the same. And so this all points back to the point I've been making since the first of this video. From that statement made within the Writers Guild of America Association Zoom call, that continuity is about an emotional river of the character and, to a great extent, how they exist within the minds of the people who are fans of this character. From there to the director of She-Hulk saying that this female empowerment story of She-Hulk was all about her expressing her emotional rage as an emotional being, to the Marvel Comics panel talking about blocking out any kinds of negative emotion when you're a creator, to the Marvel editors at Marvel Comics talking about how you can never actually say no to a creative person because it's their emotional journey, it's their emotional story, and that's as valid as any other thing, therefore you can't override that, to Nina DaCosta saying right here, it was the emotional core of this movie that she herself wanted and that Marvel themselves wanted. Therefore, it doesn't matter if the thing was put together by committee or not. It doesn't matter if this committee putting together of a movie was going to destroy continuity within the movie itself, or continuity with this movie and previous parts of the MCU. Many people pointing out that Samuel L. Jackson is a completely different character within this movie as he was within Secret Invasion, which was just out several months ago, wasn't it? It doesn't matter if there are quirky, nonsensical things which happen within the movie. It doesn't matter if it has a television sitcom Disney feel to it. It doesn't matter if the CGI is up to par with the other MCU movies. All that matters is the emotional core of this story. It's an emotional roller coaster. And so you want people to go on this emotional roller coaster to help them fulfill their hopes and dreams. Those hopes and dreams, of course, being what they came in with, expecting for this movie. And so with all of this tied together, I think you can see a very specific pattern wherein, yes, Marvel did think that this was going to be a very good movie. They thought that it was going to make money. They thought that not only for this movie, but for, I would say, this entire phase of the MCU. And they have thought that for a long time within other parts of the media that they're producing within, let's say, comic books. It is their ardent belief that they are progressives, and that's what everything hinges off of, and that society is progressing towards this ideological idea where everything is relative. If everything is relative, then the only thing that you can pin anything on is emotion, and again, since they believe themselves to be progressive, they believe that this is what society is progressing towards. First of all, I would say they're most probably within their own bubble, thinking that the majority of people within the country, at the very least, if not the world, think in this exact same relativistic emotional way. And even if it isn't the majority yet, we are progressing further and further to that point as history unfolds. Therefore, this is the future. Therefore, you create something which is based upon an emotional core, because if you want to connect with anyone, and you want to connect with your audience, if you want to sell the story, then you have to connect with what is actually there to connect the two of you. And since objectivity is not really a thing, nor anything that you can claim to be objective, like continuity or anything else, good storytelling or anything else, then you must connect through that emotional core. Present that emotional core so the audience can then connect their own emotional core to the emotional core of the product that you're making, and that's how you make a good product. And that will do well. And don't forget that this quote unquote progress can also be classified as civilization. And so it's only the civilized people that adhere to this progressive ideological mindset, which plays so much more into everything that they're doing, because if anyone disagrees with their emotional core and emotional presentation of their piece of media, well, they're just uncivilized. And you can, and hopefully the rest of the world will, ignore what they have to say by simply labeling them as haters. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are links in the description and the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels. I go back to the traditional way of making a good story with traditional virtuous heroes. Center my stories around things like death and honor and loyalty. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and order yourself one of my graphic novels today. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.